We'll fight and stand up for Ukraine's history, its culture, and its identity until that's truly secured. But if you replaced Ukraine with Germany and said, we're fighting for Germany's identity, for our history, our culture, and so on, everyone would throw up their hands and say, good heavens, what a reactionary statement. That can't possibly be coming from the Greens.
Is the use of fear as a tool a central element of authoritarian politics?
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person. Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Ich zeige Ihnen Positionen.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. I'm here to show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. With Russia for a Change in Policy is the title of this book, published last year, with a foreword by former EU Commissioner Günther Verheugen. The project was initiated by the editor, a private lecturer at the University of Bremen, who's my guest today. Welcome, Dr. Stefan Luft.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
You've published a book. 5 authors were involved. Along with you, there's Jano Kielka from Poland, Jürgen Wendler, and of course, Günther Verheugen. How did people in Bremen react?
First of all, we have to say that this invisible wall between us and the established media still exists. The mainstream outlets, daily newspapers, public broadcasters, they act as if this publication doesn't even exist. We presented the book in Berlin, we've put it out there, and it's being ignored. There was also a book presentation in Bremen. Beforehand, the then Interior Senator Ulrich Meurer, who at the time was also chair of the Conference of Interior Ministers, had agreed to give a greeting at the event. Then there was a particularly harsh critique of the book in the Taz. And after that, the Interior Senator withdrew his commitment to take part in the presentation.
So does that mean he's scared of the media? Is that fair to say?
Der Innensenator hat dann seine Zusage, an dieser Präsentation teilzunehmen, zurückgezogen.
Das heißt, er hat Schiss vor den Medien, kann man das sagen?
So würde ich es nicht ausdrücken, aber er hatte...
I wouldn't put it that way, but he probably had good political reasons to say, I'm not going to let the last 3 months of my term, after 17 years as a senator in Bremen, be ruined by this. That's how it was. Those were likely his reasons. Anyway, the result was this. We had a venue in the city center, and 46 hours before the event, it was canceled because of that media coverage. Fortunately, I managed to find another place, one that could hold 150 people instead of 50.
150 Personen gefasst hat, 160 sind da gekommen, aufgrund dieser Aufregung.
160 people showed up because of all the attention it got. Radio Bremen reported on it. And it was quite remarkable, because for me, it was the first time I'd heard on television that Taz journalists used the term, quote, subversive propaganda, referring to this book. That was new to me, that expressions like that, from the first half of the 20th century, from the Third Reich and so on, are now being used by left-leaning media as well.
So basically, they're accusing you of undermining the country's defense just because this book, in its title, argues for something that's actually a core principle of our basic law, our Constitution, namely keeping peace with our neighbors and preserving peace in general. Do I have that right?
Exactly. From my point of view, or from our point of view as the 3 authors, the title is in no way scandalous. It could just as well have been called With China. But Russia is the largest neighbor of the European Union. It's part of Europe. And we have, or should have, the greatest possible interest in maintaining a good neighborly relationship with Russia, the largest country by area in the world, the biggest resource nation, and the largest nuclear power. Ideally, that relationship should exist within a European security framework. But the opposite is happening, and anyone who argues for such a good neighbor relationship is discredited, discriminated against, and pushed into corners where they definitely don't belong.
Is that political persecution?
No, that didn't really have any consequences for me. It didn't exactly do my blood pressure any good, but that's something you just have to accept. Still, there were no real consequences. I wasn't punished in any way because of it, and I didn't face any professional or financial disadvantages. That simply wasn't the case.
In the case of Ulrike Guerreau or Patrick Baud, that was different.
Ist es eindeutig anders. Insofern unterscheidet sich das, was Sie und Frau Guerreau und andere erfahren haben, grundsätzlich. Also ich werde in Ruhe gelassen. Ich kann in Ruhe meiner Arbeit nachgehen. Das schätze ich auch. Und insofern habe ich da keinen Grund, mich zu beklagen, aber es ist natürlich so, es hat auch für
But of course, it's true. There was a storm of outrage on Twitter over my first book, The War in Ukraine, Why Europe Needs a New Policy of Détente, which came out in 2023. That happened after I was interviewed about it on Deutschlandfunk. Those aren't pleasant experiences, that's just the way it is. There's a certain sense of isolation and, well, when you're personally affected by it, it's not very pleasant. But you have to accept it.
Why are those who follow the Constitution in word and spirit being isolated today?
That has to do with the fact that according to those in power in politics, the media, culture, and business, we're no longer in a state of peace, but somewhere between peace and a state of tension. The idea is this: Russia will attack the European Union, or NATO, sometime toward the end of the 2020s. Right now, people are talking about the year 2029. And until then, there's supposed to be a preliminary phase in which covert warfare is already taking place. We all know how that goes. Just recently, there were claims that sex toys containing explosives had been found, and of course, it was immediately clear who was to blame: Russia. That's going to be one of the main issues we'll be dealing with.
Das wird eine der wesentlichen Beschäftigungen.
Also Putin möchte auch schon unser Sexualleben unter Kontrolle bringen.
So Putin even wants to control our sex lives now. In my piece, I looked into a number of cases that were listed by Die Zeit, where it was claimed these were attacks or incidents linked to Russian intelligence services. And as a scientific observer, I was able to determine to a significant extent that many of these incidents had already been clarified. In some cases, it turned out they were carried out by left-wing extremists in France or by other actors. And in many other cases, the situation was still unresolved. But the first reaction was always to say, Russia is responsible. And that attitude already defines the general climate toward Russia.
Und das Klima kennzeichnet ja ohnehin die Gesellschaft.
Putin ist an allem schuld, für alles verantwortlich.
Putin is blamed for everything, held responsible for everything, and supposedly wants to invade us before the decade is over. But one of the most important geopolitical experts, Professor John J. Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, lists a whole series of reasons why Russia will not attack NATO. It starts with the fact that Putin has said this several times himself, that the Russians invaded Ukraine with 190,000 troops, nowhere near enough to occupy the entire country. And that, as a strategist, Putin has no reason to take on all of NATO. But that's not being heard.
Das wird nicht gehört.
Diese Stimmen werden nicht gehört.
Those voices aren't being heard. They fade away in a very limited space for public debate. They're being pushed aside. There are, of course, online channels, especially English language ones, where American military experts or political scientists like Mearsheimer speak out on these issues. But that's not being heard, it's not being discussed. On the contrary, we now have this so-called Operationsplan Germany, which is still classified. Only a short summary has been made public. The full version remains under lock and key.
Die Fassung ist unter Verschluss, aber wir haben ja durch den Operationsplan Deutschland.
But with the Operationsplan Germany, we're seeing this phenomenon I've called politicizing soldiers. These are members of the Bundeswehr who go out into all kinds of social groups, give talks, and sometimes express rather simplistic political views. I wouldn't hold that against you personally, because you probably haven't studied social or political science, and as an officer, you don't have to. But in that case, one should at least be cautious when it comes to making political statements. And it's clear that this level of simplification, this kind of propaganda, has increased quite a lot. That, by the way, was also the reason we said we needed to do a follow-up, to publish a second book, even though that always involves a great deal of effort.
Is the German population supposed to be brainwashed?
I wouldn't use that term myself. I think it can make sense in certain contexts. But here, we still have access to a variety of media. I mean, if I want to, I can get information from public broadcasters or from certain online channels. I don't have to rely on just one side, like those who, at 7:45 in the evening, turn on ARD and wait for the nightly news. That's something I still remember from when I was a kid.
Das kenne ich noch aus meiner Kinderzeit. Da war sozusagen dieser Hausaltar, war das Fernsehen.
Back then, you could say there was this kind of household altar. That was the television in the 1960s and 70s. People would watch it together. Everyone gathered in the living room for the evening news. And that was clearly not unusual. Of course, the media landscape has changed dramatically since then. So I'd say these days, you really have to make an effort if you don't just want to know what you're supposed to know, but if you actually want to be well informed, that opportunity still exists today.
Die Möglichkeit gibt es heute auch weiterhin.
Ein Bericht des US-Kongresses.
A report from the U.S. Congress states, based on testimony from all the major internet company CEOs and on internal material from those companies, that Brussels manipulated 8 elections within the European Union. It also says that the digital corporations were forced, under threat of multi-billion-dollar fines, to moderate, meaning to censor, content critical of the EU. And the word censorship actually appears in that report. Russian media outlets like RT and Sputnik are banned in the EU. Are we living under a dome of censorship?
In der EU gesperrt, leben wir unter einer Glocke der Zensur.
Also, es ist zumindest so.
Well, at the very least, the European Union believes that we have to counter the enemy's propaganda, but not by providing information or clarification on their part, rather by imposing bans. For example, during the Second World War, Britain didn't ban the German enemy broadcasts. Instead, they informed the public. They said, this is propaganda from the National Socialist German Reich, but they didn't prohibit it. And that tendency to say, we have to protect the population, is very strong today.
Die Bevölkerung schützen. Die Bevölkerung ist nicht, die Menschen sind nicht die Bürger.
It seems that the public, the people, the citizens, well, they're obviously not considered mature enough to form their own opinions. Instead, there's an effort to make sure they come into as little contact as possible with political statements from Russia or from anywhere else, even from people within their own country. And in my view, that's a completely wrong approach. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association are essential elements of a liberal democratic order. We already saw during the COVID period that the freedom to assemble and to form opinions was heavily restricted. And of course, we're seeing that again now.
Und das erlebt man ja natürlich jetzt auch.
Das Verwaltungsgericht Schleswig-Holstein hat in meinem Fall
The Administrative Court of Schleswig-Holstein ruled in my favor and explained to the University of Kiel that freedom of information and expression under Article 5 of the Basic Law, as well as academic freedom, are rights that protect citizens from the state. The court declared my immediate dismissal illegal. Now, the University of Kiel has sent out a circular from the university's executive board to all staff and students saying, quote, all students are prohibited from traveling to Russia. What do you think about that?
Nach Russland zu fahren. Was halten Sie davon? Das war ein wörtliches Zitat.
I'm firmly convinced that the university has no right to issue such a ban. Where would that lead us? I mean, if someone tells me I'm not allowed to go to Cuba, to Venezuela, or anywhere else, well, I really don't see where the university gets the authority to impose that kind of restriction on its members. Of course, they can make recommendations for safety reasons, but that's something entirely different.
Exactly. One could also imagine that, given the illegal war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran, students, as they're called, or even staff members might be banned from traveling to the U.S. or to Israel.
That would be absurd. And it's also part of this policy to cut off almost all connections with Russia, even at the level of what's called civil society. Things like the Petersburg dialogues, city partnerships, all of that is being systematically dismantled. And I think that's a mistake. Someone once said, how are we ever supposed to work with Russia again if we label Russia, its politics, and the current Russian president as the enemy of humanity, as a devil, which was actually a direct quote from Ms. Strack-Zimmerman. I really wonder, how are we ever supposed to build a productive and reasonable relationship with Russia again? I just heard that some, I think, East German state premier said we should maybe start thinking about whether, at some point, we might once again import raw materials from Russia.
Rohstoffe von Russland bezieht, aber dazu gehören ja immer zwei. Ja, man muss
But it always takes two for that. You first have to ask whether Russia even has any interest at all, given the kind of fanaticism we've seen in how Germany has dealt with Russia over the past few years, since 2022, but even before that. It's been an absolute disaster. I went back and read again what Ms. Baerbock has done. Of all people, the foreign minister, who never missed a chance at any press event on the international stage to use her remarks about Russia to personally insult them in a serious way. And I think that's completely inappropriate. A foreign minister who behaves like that has totally misunderstood her office. And as a result, this policy has caused lasting damage to our relationship with Russia.
Nachhaltig zu zerstören, ist einfach fatal.
Where does that come from, this kind of fanaticism? Is it that Ms. Baerbock just can't behave herself? Is this a campaign coming from some corner, deliberately orchestrated? Are people doing this out of ignorance or because they're afraid themselves? Was this initiated by NATO as part of cognitive warfare? Where do you see the causes?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of everything. I see the main cause in this so-called values-based politics. Values-based politics carries a built-in dynamic of aggression. I mean, if I say we have different interests, and maybe we disagree on how to assess those interests and how to work things out together, then usually you can find a compromise. You can put together a package, you can meet halfway, or one side gives in a little, something like that. But with values-based politics, it's different. There, the idea is that we embody the values.
Dass man sagt, wir verkörpern die Werte und das Gegenüber ist sozusagen.
And the other side is, so to speak, the counterpart. That really fits into this kind of Manichaean politics, this politics of dualism between good and evil. And in my view, that's also led to a radicalization of green politics. If you take another look at the statements the Greens have made since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you can clearly see that in their party resolutions or various decisions, there's a striking pattern. On one side, we are the good ones. We stand for human rights. We stand for humanity. And on the other, they represent evil.
Und die anderen verkörpern das Böse. Sie hat dem russischen Außenminister
She accused the Russian foreign minister at an international meeting, saying, "Your tanks bring destruction. Your tanks don't bring baby food. Your tanks don't bring water." And of course, that's the difference compared to NATO tanks. Those apparently always bring baby food, water, and everything else people might need. So, in part, well, I don't even want to use that phrase about a full turnaround, but in part, it's just a bit childish. That certainly has something to do with the personality of the foreign minister at the time, who has now, after all, moved up to the United Nations. But in my view, it mainly comes down to this so-called values-based policy.
Vorwiegend an dieser Wertepolitik. Es liegt auch daran, dass natürlich mit der Regierungsbeteiligung der
It's also because, of course, when the Greens joined the government at the end of the 1990s, they were forced to move away from their more pacifist stance. In the beginning, they saw themselves as the political arm of the peace movement. But naturally, during the Yugoslav war, when they entered government back then, with Schroeder and Joschka Fischer, it was inevitable. If you wanted to be part of that government, you had to align yourself with NATO's position. And that's exactly what they did. They did it with a kind of zeal, and how should I put it, a sort of anticipatory obedience that looking back is really quite remarkable.
Der im Nachhinein betrachtet sehr beeindruckend ist.
Identitäre Politik, werteorientierte
Identity-based politics, or values-driven politics, starts by asserting the validity of one's own social group or nation, and it tends to lecture other nations. The historian Götz Ali has said, referring to the Green Party, that the National Socialists were also an identity-based movement, just like the Greens. Would you agree with that?
Wie die Grünen. Würden Sie dem zustimmen?
Ja, ich bin solchen.
I'm generally not a fan of that kind of sharp polarization. I'd say that identity politics, and that's really the core of this statement, has to do with drawing boundaries, excluding others, and devaluing them. In other words, we are the ones who count, and the others are seen as less than our group. What really struck me in this conflict in Ukraine was that the Greens said, I looked it up again, I can't quote it word for word, but Green politicians said something along the lines of, we will fight for the history, the culture, and the identity of Ukraine, and will stand up for it until it's truly secured.
Bis das sozusagen gesichert ist. Wenn man da jetzt statt Ukraine
If you replaced Ukraine with Germany and said, we're fighting for Germany's identity, for our history, our culture, and so on, everyone would throw up their hands and say, good heavens, what a reactionary statement. That can't possibly come from the Greens. So obviously there are some ethnic or national identities that are considered worth protecting, and others that are seen as less so, or not at all.
Und andere, die sind es weniger oder gar nicht.
Beeindruckend finde ich.
What I find striking about those statements you just quoted is that the people saying them don't actually know Ukraine, and they've never been in a war zone.
Aber auch noch nie in einem Kriegsgebiet waren.
Gut, das kommt natürlich hinzu.
That's certainly another factor. That's true. The understanding of the situation and the conditions there is probably, as with most people in Germany, rather limited.
Bei den meisten Leuten in Deutschland eher gering ausgeprägt.
Sie haben in diesem Buch
In this book, you took a deep look at the Operationsplan Germany. You talk about it, and you mentioned it earlier. It's your area of expertise. But that plan is classified. So what's actually in it?
Der ist ja geheim. Was steht denn drin?
Naja, der Operationsplan Deutschland.
Well, the Operationsplan Deutschland is a plan aimed at preparing civil society, meaning private organizations, logistics companies, airlines, all kinds of institutions, administrations, and authorities, basically everyday life, for a potential war. The goal is to get municipalities and federal states ready as well. That's what this Operationsplan Deutschland is about, and joint exercises are being planned and carried out. There's another plan that's part of the Operationsplan Deutschland, but that one has actually been made public. It deals with civil-military cooperation. That document has been published, and it covers things like hospital infrastructure. It's part of the overall Operationsplan Deutschland and part of this civil-military cooperation plan. It's quite interesting to read. I came across it in a book. The point is, it says we need to prepare for the fact that Germany's hospital infrastructure isn't adequately equipped for a state of tension, and even less so for an actual war.
Ausreichend aufgestellt ist. Interessant ist in dem Zusammenhang, dass ja
What's interesting in this context is that in the last legislative period, both the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Health belonged to the same party, the SPD. One of them promoted a hospital structure that involves reducing the number of hospitals, and the other, the defense minister, made it clear, at least according to those plans, that first, the Bundeswehr hospitals would be withdrawn from civilian care, and second, that civilian hospitals would primarily be available for the wounded and severely injured. And the public, he said, needs to be prepared for the fact that in the event of war, soldiers would be given priority, and that other treatments, whatever they may be, would have to be postponed for the time being.
andere Behandlungen, was auch immer, erstmal zurückgestellt werden. Nun haben wir heute schon lange Wartezeiten.
Right now, we're already seeing long waiting times. And in this plan for civil-military cooperation, they actually publish numbers. They say we should expect about 1,000 injured people per day, and about a third of them will need intensive care. And they also admit there's a problem. The surgical training of doctors in Germany isn't prepared for these specific kinds of war injuries, including those caused by drones. I know that's true because I often talk with doctors, and they tell me the same thing. They say, yes, that's right. We don't really know how to treat these severe vascular injuries and all the complications that come with them. So in the end, it's basically an admission of failure.
Also es ist im Grunde genommen ein Offenbarungseid.
Berlin's hospitals are already overwhelmed in their emergency rooms when there's black ice.
Und insofern ist es eigentlich.
So in that sense, it's actually hard to understand. Sure, it's being reported, but it doesn't really resonate anywhere. You don't get the sense that people are saying, yeah, this is being debated, this is controversial. Instead, it's just brushed off with, well, those are the challenges, that's what happens in war. I can't quite make sense of that.
Ich kann das nicht ganz nachvollziehen.
Is a Russian threat being painted on the wall here to push for a broad militarization of society? In other words, a shift from a civil society to a militarized one.
Also die Rüstungsindustrie.
Well, the arms industry in Germany is really experiencing a boom right now. It's almost hard to believe. Within the European Union, Germany is the country investing the most in military equipment. And if this 5% NATO target ever actually gets implemented, we'd be looking at somewhere between 40 and 50% of the federal budget being spent on military purposes. Everyone should understand that this simply can't happen without massive cuts in social programs, in education, and in other areas of public spending.
Wo auch immer, bei anderen öffentlichen Ausgaben, ja. Und
So there's this strong push toward militarization. You can see it even in the schools. In Bavaria, for example, there's now a law that requires schools to let representatives of the German armed forces come in and speak, but of course not representatives of peace initiatives or anything like that. However, based on my own experience, especially through my contact with my students, I believe that a significant part of this so-called Generation Z we currently have at the universities is not willing to go along with that.
Dass ein erheblicher Teil von denen nicht bereit ist.
Was passiert denn da?
What's actually happening in society here? Is this about opening up a new profitable field now that it's become clear the sanctions against Russia are turning into an economic dud?
Ökonomischen Rohrkrepiere?
Das kann sein, dass das eine Rolle spielt.
That may be true. It might play a role. It might be a source of hope. But there are economists who say the defense industry won't make up for what we're losing through deindustrialization, especially in the automotive sector and other industries. So yes, that may be the case.
Ja, das kann sein.
Interessant ist, dass
What's interesting is that all political forces across the entire ruling party cartel are supporting this course of militarization. Not a single politician from that ruling party cartel is calling for German peace initiatives, even though that's actually what the Constitution requires. So where does that come from?
Grundgesetz eigentlich fordert. Woher rührt das?
Ja, das ist in der
Yes, that really is remarkable. Among the parties represented in the Bundestag, there are basically only figures like Günther Verheugen or Peter Gauweiler from the CSU, people who no longer hold political office, who are retired, who still speak out, but who've been marginalized within their own parties. On the other hand, there are people like CDU Member of Parliament Kiesewetter, who can openly say about his own parliamentary group, yes, there's a Moscow connection in our faction. And I find that quite remarkable, because it shows that anyone who doesn't support the war policy and the Russia policy with the same intensity as Kiesewetter.
Und den Russlandkurs vertreten, die werden diffamiert als Vertreter einer.
They're being smeared as part of some so-called Moscow connection, whatever that's supposed to mean. In a case like that, a parliamentary leader or a party chair should really speak up publicly, since the accusation was made publicly, and say, I won't allow parts of my party to be discredited like this. But apparently that's just being accepted. Overall, you have to say, the range of opinions is very narrow. There's a lot of pressure to follow the lines set by those in power.
Der Herrschenden zu befolgen, den gibt's. Es hat immer schon Fraktionen.
There's always been party discipline and all sorts of internal pressures, but there used to be a willingness to break ranks on certain issues. In my view, that's become much rarer. The pressure people feel now is enormous, because everyone knows what kind of wave of insults and denunciations will come down on anyone who says, folks, it can't be in our well-understood German interest to end up in a war with Russia in just a few years. We have to, well, the Chancellor has to go to Moscow and start talks. And it just can't be that he's now in his second year in office, more or less, and hasn't even tried to start any kind of conversation. But anyone who said that publicly would be pretty much torn apart.
Würde öffentlich ziemlich niedergemacht.
Wenn doch klar ist, dass diese
If it's clear that this warmongering can't possibly be in Germany's true best interest, then where is the pressure coming from? Am I wrong to suspect that we're dealing with politicians influenced by transatlantic networks? People who've tied their careers to organizations like the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Bridge, or the Young Global Leaders?
Atlantikbrücke, Young Global Leaders geknüpft haben.
Das spielt sicherlich.
That definitely plays a major role, no doubt about it. You can clearly see that when you look at people's backgrounds. And I'd say this ideology, this so-called politics of values that was mentioned earlier, also plays a part. The idea that the European Union is a community of values, committed to what you might call a woke agenda, in a broader sense. And you can see, for example, in Russia, though not only there, that this isn't wanted, it's not pursued, it's criticized, in one way or another. That may also be a factor in Russia. In any case, you're absolutely right. This impertinence, this harshness, this uncompromising attitude with which one side is attacked in this conflict, and any thought of diplomacy is condemned and discredited. That's something that, I have to say, really strikes me as well.
Was in der Tat beeindruckt mich auch sehr. Ja.
Wie kann sich denn die europäische
How can the European Union present itself as a community of values when it comes to Russia if it betrays its own democratic values through censorship measures and extralegal sanctions, like those against Hussein Dolu or Jacques Baud?
oder Jacques Baud verrät?
Ja, also das sind diese doppelten
Yes, these are the double standards that have cost the West a lot of political credibility. And we can see more and more that these double standards don't work, that they're not acceptable, and that this kind of moral arrogance, combined with the kind of misconduct you described, has, in my view, discredited the West in large parts of the world. And we can also see, in the case of Jacques Baud, that he's now trying to defend himself. He's obtained, through a lawyer, the files on which the Council of the European Union based its decisions. He's not allowed to publish them or share them with anyone, but he says they're based on contributions written by others about him.
Von anderen über ihn verfasst wurden, also es sind weniger Interviews mit ihm oder sowas, sondern
So it's not just fewer interviews with him or things like that. There are also defamatory pieces that have been written about him. And the whole point of this is to create a politics of fear. That was made very clear at the Federal Press Conference. They said, yes, these resolutions apply, but they actually have no legal force. They're decisions made by the Council, and you're not heard beforehand. So it's not a rule of law process. Not anywhere. But the representatives of the ministries in Germany say, yes, the resolutions are correct, and everyone should be warned. It could happen to anyone. You or me. It could happen to anyone. There are enough denunciatory articles about you, about me, about whoever. And when you put all that together, it's obvious. They're relying on fear, on intimidation. And that creates an atmosphere where you just can't...
A state that uses intimidation combined with the attempt, actually the successful attempt, to use criminal law against political opponents. That's a classic sign of a dictatorship, isn't it?
Well, there's definitely a strong trend toward a more authoritarian state. In Germany, within the EU, there's really no question about that. On the one hand, law enforcement agencies are completely overwhelmed, and on the other, they jump into action over some ridiculous post on Twitter or wherever. That's a contradiction in itself. So I'd say, yes, we're moving toward an authoritarian state. There's a strong focus on using fear as a tool. And again, you can see the parallel to the COVID period, when people were told, if you visit your grandparents at Christmas and infect them, they could die, and so on. This politics of fear, it has an effect. And yes, that's what we're seeing.
Is the use of fear as a tool a central element of authoritarian politics?
Absolutely, totally clear. Hate, fear, no question about it.
Are these resentments, these emotions, being stirred up to tighten control over the population and exploit them more?
Well, at least to justify the cutbacks that have already been announced, and in some areas, like the social sector, partly carried out. That's absolutely clear.
So, more money goes into armaments. That's taken from the public by stirring up fear. By mobilizing fear and aggression against an external enemy, the population is being conditioned to go along with the game.
Yes, although the surveys still show, well, they're different surveys, that's true, but it still seems that about half the population in the eastern states, maybe even a bit more, say they don't want a war with Russia. On the other hand, surveys also show that rearmament is supported by a large majority, around 60 to 70%. That's not really surprising, because there's constant promotion of it everywhere. Or you could also say propaganda. I don't believe there's any general hatred of Russians in Germany or anything like that. I think many people still say we have to resolve conflicts peacefully. Last year, I came across a little book, since I'm from Bavaria and I've always been interested in the political situation there. I found a book from 2015. It's called At the Abyss, and the author is Wilfried Scharnagl. He was one of Franz Josef Strauss's closest confidants, his collaborator and intellectual partner, the editor-in-chief of the Bayern Courier. And he wrote this book about Ukraine policy, which came out shortly before his death. The reason for it was that he wanted to recount that flight and that trip Franz Josef Strauss took to Moscow in December 1987 at Gorbachev's invitation. And it's really striking how clearly the book shows that Strauss, despite all criticism and political distance, told Gorbachev very plainly that it could never be in anyone's political interest for Germany to ever again engage in military conflict with Russia.
Today we're seeing exactly the opposite.
What we're seeing today is exactly the opposite. But it really is remarkable that the patriarch of the CSU, who still carried the experiences of a World War II soldier in his bones even decades later, and who also knew the blood price paid by the Soviet Union, by the people there, and that truly is impressive. Well, that's something that should probably be pointed out to those who still like to display those big Franz Josef Strauss portraits at their party conventions.
Und der Leutnant Strauss.
Lieutenant Strauss knew what war really means. And today, we have a generation of politicians who clearly have no idea what war is. Does this generation of politicians need to be replaced because they can't grasp the consequences of their actions?
Weil sie die Folgen ihres Tuns nicht übersieht.
Naja, also, was soll man sagen?
Well, what can you say? In Germany, we have free and secret elections. Of course, the generation that's now in charge across all the parties represented in the Bundestag shares responsibility for this course. You could say that the left-wing parties can be seen a bit differently, maybe cut them some slack. They're struggling with this. But the BSW didn't make it back into the Bundestag. Before the federal election, they had a very clear, analytically clear position on this war. So in the end, yes, those responsible should be replaced. But I don't see much chance of that happening. You can see it in the state elections too. The SPD is in danger of failing to clear the 5% threshold. Yet the biggest warmongers, the Greens and the CDU, came out stronger from this election, for example now in Baden-Württemberg. Of course, it was a state election, and you could say voters use different criteria when they decide how to vote. But still, it's already now.
Wenn in Baden-Württemberg fast 32%.
When almost 32% of the votes cast in Baden-Württemberg went to the Greens, and almost 31% went to the CDU, that means 63% of the votes went to parties that promote war. So, is the population of Baden-Württemberg, in a psychiatric sense, a hopeless case?
In einem psychiatrischen Sinne ein hoffnungsloser Fall.
Nein, das glaube ich nicht. Ich glaube einfach, dass die
No, I don't think so. I just believe they had different criteria. They looked at it from a state-level political perspective. They've experienced a black-green coalition government over the last legislative term. The previous minister-president was very successful in terms of approval ratings, and the CDU candidate, obviously, didn't have the personal qualities people expect from a state leader. So, it really wouldn't be fair to blame the voters for that. I do see the outcome the same way, of course, but there's still a difference between a state election and a federal election. And I can imagine that in the next federal election, the CDU and the Greens might not, let's say, crash completely. That's certainly possible.
nicht abstürzen werden. Also das kann durchaus sein.
Shakespeare writes in the tragedy King Lear, "That's the curse of the times, when fools lead the blind."
Ja, das ist
Yeah, it's striking to see how apathetic even the younger generation is, the very people who would actually be affected. I mean, we're all affected by this war. The whole country is being destroyed. And I'm saying, if there's another war with Russia, we can expect it to be the last war in Europe. But against that backdrop, it's really remarkable how indifferent people seem to this development. I keep thinking maybe things will change, once the first draft notices are lying on kitchen tables. By then, it might be late, maybe too late, who knows. But I'm not sure the students finishing high school right now really understand what's coming their way, that at some point they might be assigned to the Eastern Front.
Where does this apathy come from, especially among the cannon fodder?
I find it hard to say myself, hard to really understand. There's clearly some kind of hesitation when it comes to dealing with these issues. I can understand that. Well, not completely, because it's really an existential question. Not just for those who are now old enough to be called up for military service, but actually for everyone. But where that hesitation comes from, whether there's still a bit of that old submissive mindset at play, the idea that, well, the state will take care of it, and if the authorities say so, then I just can't imagine this generation marching off to war with drums and trumpets. That's not going to happen.
What role do the ideological apparatuses play in all this? The ones that are flooding the public with a wave of propaganda. I'm thinking of those so-called non-governmental organizations that are actually funded by the state, and of think tanks financed by the government or by industry. I'm also thinking of the university institutes, because it's striking how almost all academics are joining in the war fever, with only a few exceptions.
There are exceptions, yes.
There are two of us sitting here.
Yes, there are others as well. But it's clear that the mainstream plays a major role at universities too. There's no question about that. So there are these think tanks, liberal, modern, whatever you want to call them, that are well funded with state money and engage in shaping political opinion, to put it mildly. They play a big role. And what also plays a major role is the uniformity of the major media, not just public broadcasting, but also the big newspapers. When I think back to the early 1980s, when there was that debate about what was called rearmament, there were those huge demonstrations, and even in the media, there was still a real diversity of opinions. There were parts of the SPD that strongly rejected it. Helmut Schmidt supported it. The CDU and CSU supported it as well. But there was also a lot of opposition. There was that big demonstration in the Hofgarten in Bonn. So, in that sense, and that kind of pluralism hardly exists anymore today. Those who disagree are marginalized, silenced, or at best, can still speak out on social media, on YouTube, on channels like yours. But in the major media, that hardly happens anymore. You can see that on Deutschlandfunk, but also on many other broadcasters. Altogether, that plays a big role in why this uniformity, this one-sidedness, has taken hold.
The poet Bertolt Brecht points out that academics, and journalists too, get paid for their thoughts and deliver what's been ordered. In his play Turando, or The Whitewasher, he writes that people's thoughts stink like rotten fish because they're traded like goods at a fish market. Would you agree with that?
That's a bit too much for me right now. I can't really...
You don't have to, you know.
Sorry.
That's all fine. You don't have to agree with everything.
You could say it's really no different. Yes, there are colleagues who disagree with the dominant view. You find them in the social sciences, among legal scholars, and in other fields as well. Each academic discipline has its own level of tolerance for dissent. Sometimes I get the impression that lawyers are a bit more open to it than others. But I've seen the same thing in migration research. There are still people who voice disagreement, but they don't have much of a chance to be heard.
Keine große Chance auf Resonanz. Man muss natürlich sagen, der
You have to keep in mind, a scientist isn't focused on getting approval. A scientist isn't looking for applause. A scientist is focused on truth, on gaining knowledge, and that should be the standard. If you want applause, you should go into politics, where you say, yes, I'm seeking support. But as a scientist, you don't need to seek approval. You need to stand by the things you've thought through, the things you believe to be true, or at least legitimate and plausible.
plausibel sind, muss man das vertreten.
Und Sie haben viel Energie.
You put a lot of energy into this book, into developing it, into your contribution to the operations plan for Germany. What gave you the strength to do that, given how pessimistic our analysis was?
Pessimistischen Analyse die Kraft dazu gegeben.
Ich habe 4 Kinder und ich bin
I have 4 children, and I'm personally convinced that everyone has to do their part to call out these wrong developments and push back against them. Each of us has to do what's within our power. For me, as a scientist, that means writing texts, publishing books. That's my contribution. I don't ever want to look back and have to blame myself for not speaking out clearly enough about developments that could end disastrously for all of us.
alle verheerend enden können.
Dr. Stefan Luft will den
Dr. Stefan Luft wants to stand up against the political failures that lead to war and even more war. He co-authored and co-edited the book with Russia for a New Policy. Thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Bob. Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. Stay with us.
Die Propagandamedien verschweigen. Bleiben Sie dabei.